right, here we go.
Can we check everybody's audio? Ace, can we hear you?
Yeah, what's up?
Great. Mick, can we check your audio?
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Can folks hear me? You can just give me a thumbs up if you can hear me. Key, can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Good evening, folks. My name is Elisa Crespo. I use she and her pronouns, and I am the executive director of the New Pride Agenda. I want to thank you all for attending our statewide virtual town hall towards equity. This evening, you're going to hear from a number of policy experts and advocates. We're going to do a brief recap of some of our legislative wins from earlier in the year. We're also going to have a presentation from the Equal Rights, New Yorkers for Equal Rights. And then we're going to take a very short 5-minute break if there's time. And then we're going to get into the crux of tonight's town hall, which is a conversation between our policy council and a number of advocates and policy experts from some of our partner organizations. And finally, we're going to close by launching our 2024 LGBTQ Community Ballot Initiative, which will be live for 2 months. And we want everyone, every LGBTQ identified person in New York State to vote on this ballot because this is the community's agenda. And so without further ado, I am going to kick it to my colleague, Britton Hargers, who's going to talk to us about 2 of our legislative wins from earlier in the session that ended in June of 2023. And then he'll kick it back to me, and I'll talk to you about another 2 bills, and so on and so forth. So thank you so much for being here, Britton Hargers.
Greetings, everyone. Thank you, Elisa. Thank you all for being here. We greatly appreciate your time. I am the Director of Advocacy and Community Engagement here at New Pride Agenda, and I will be kicking off our legislative wins of 2023. Last year, some of you know, New York joined 10 other states and Washington, D.C., which have similar shield law protecting transgender youth and families. The governor signed one here, the Safe Haven for Trans and Youth Families Act. And I'm just going to briefly break down to you exactly what that act does and 4 key components. So the Safe Haven for Trans and Youth and Families Act ensures that New York will not cooperate with subpoenas from other states who have banned gender affirming care for youth. We will provide immunity for gender affirming care providers here in New York. We will ensure that no trans kids, including non-binary and gender non-conforming children, will be separated from their families who attempt to assist them in getting legal gender affirming care. This bill also protects the health information for those seeking gender affirming care here throughout New York State. For me, that is very important when we think about right now the attacks that trans youth are under. So being able to be a safe haven for trans youth, their families, for providers is really important, I think, in each and every one of our lives. So we are definitely thankful to be a part of that movement. And I would also like to talk about the expansion of the Trans Equity Fund. So in 2022, New Pride Agenda, we spearheaded a statewide coalition to create the Lorena Bojas Trans Equity Fund. The purpose of this fund was to provide grants to trans-led organizations across New York State. As we all know, there is not enough money that goes back into our trans communities. And for every $100 awarded, we all know that only 4% of those $100 actually make it. Actually, out of every $100 actually awarded, 4% fund now sits in between 2 departments. That is the Department of Mental Health and the Department of Health. Our goal is to expand this. Our goal is to expand the the Trans Equity Fund into multiple state agencies in the future. And as of today, this fund is annually $4 million. And I'll say that again, the fund is $4 million annually, and that's between the governor's office and the legislature. And we will continue to push the expansion until transgender and non-binary folks are literally living and thriving in their best, but also to reach our fully funded $15 million goal over a multi-year period. If there is anyone who would like to learn any more about the RFPs or just any more about the Trans Equity Fund itself, or to ask questions in regards to the Safe Haven bill and who it protects, how it protects, please contact New Pride Agenda. Please contact us at newprideagenda.org, and I will also drop the email address in the chat for you all.
Thank you so much, Britton. I guess it's back to me, yeah?
I think so.
Thank you. And I just want to shout out some people that I see who are here with us. Of course, we see Jazzy Alejandro, our Community Health and Outreach Coordinator. I see Jadi. I see Alicia Cohen from up in Newburgh, Melissa Sklar, Sheila Healy, Vladimir Martinez, Kiara St. James. So many folks that we work with in community and do this work. Shout out to Ali Bohm. I see Elizabeth Cooper, one of our board members. So really glad that you all are here with us. So in addition to the two bills that Britton covered just now, I want to talk to you about two more bills. One which has been signed by the governor on November 8th, and one that actually has not been signed yet, but that has passed both houses in the legislature. So there's going to be a little call to action there. But let's start first with the intersex education bill, which was sponsored by State Senator Brad Hoylman Siegel and Assemblymember Rebecca Seawright, both champions for the LGBTQ community here in New York. As I stated before, the intersex education bill signed recently is a first in the nation bill, meaning that New York State is the first state out of the whole 50 states in the US to have a bill of this kind. And essentially the bill requires that the New York State Department of Health conduct a public information and outreach campaign on medically unnecessary treatments that are performed on intersex individuals. And so what does that mean? It means that oftentimes, not always, intersex youth, when they are born, there are people making decisions about their bodies without their consent. And often there is no medical purpose for these cosmetic procedures. It is often a preference of the parents or the legal guardians. And so we know from research that intersex people who grow up and become adults often have psychological problems and issues with depression and things like that as a result. And so we are really proud that New York is the first in the country to have such a piece of legislation. And we are proud of the intersex advocates at Interact, and NYCLU was very instrumental on this bill as well. So that was a huge win for us this session. And then secondly, we also passed the LGBTQ Long-Term Care Facility Bill of Rights. And what that does is that it prohibits long-term care facility staff from discriminating against any resident on the basis of such resident's actual or perceived sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, or HIV status. You may be asking, why is this important? Well, because in 2011, there was a study done by SAGE, by the Task Force, by Lambda Legal, the National Center for Lesbian Rights, and the National Center for Transgender Equality. And the findings of this report showed that 78% of LGBTQ seniors felt that they could not be open with the staff about their sexual orientation or gender identity. And a majority of all the respondents identified being discriminated. In fact, 89% of them identified as having faced discrimination at some point in their life while living in a long-term care assisted facility. So again, this bill was signed, was passed by the Assembly and the Senate here in New York, but it has not been signed yet by our governor. So We encourage you to reach out to the governor's office and ask her to sign this bill because our LGBTQ seniors are a vulnerable population and their lives matter. And so those are 4 bills, 3 of which have been signed and 1 that we are waiting to be signed. Now, the next thing on our agenda is we were going to have a presentation from New Yorkers for Equal Rights, but I'm not sure if Nia is here. Nia, are you with us?
Hi, everyone.
There we go. Nia, please introduce yourself and please tell us what is the New York State Equal Rights Amendment and why it matters.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone, for inviting me to come and speak about this. My name is Nia Alvarez-Mapp. I am the organizing directors for New Yorkers for Equal Rights. We are a ballot initiative committee that is aiming to get the ERA onto the New York State's Constitution. And we're really just here to bring awareness. I'm really just here to bring awareness to you all about what this ballot entail and why you should go out to vote and flip the ballot over for November 2024 in regards to saying yes to this particular amendment. So I'm just gonna go click on some slides real quickly to show you guys some. Yeah, so next I'm gonna just, So yes, my name is Nia Alvarez-Mapp. I go by she, her, Aya. And you are all probably wondering, what is New Yorkers for Equal Rights? Next. Well, New Yorkers for Equal Rights is a ballot initiative committee that is trying to get the equal rights and the New York State Equal Rights Amendment onto the New York State Constitution, which makes the Constitution explicitly protect underrepresented classes within New York State against any form of discrimination. Next. And in this particular, what we mean by that is that this amendment will prohibit discrimination based off of national origins, ethnicity, age, disability, sex, and including sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, pregnancy and pregnancy outcomes, and which in regards especially to reproductive health care and autonomy. So in other words, we are aiming to, we're aiming to really enhance all discriminatory acts. We're willing to enhance the all protective acts against discriminatory for all the underrepresented classes in New York, and also add in more protections for those who are aiming to work with reproductive rights and reproductive health within New York State. This bill will, so you're all probably wondering again, why are we trying to have this bill in our Constitution instead of, since we already have so many previous bills? Well, these bills tend to be, I would say the best way to say is that a lot of the bills, yes, are passed in New York. However, with the Constitution, it is going to be legally binding, which makes it really hard for it to be repealed or be overturned. And therefore, again, it's decided by the people. So it's just a way to enhance and also to expand on any anti-discriminatory laws that are happening in New York State. And again, to clarify, to also and make sure that things such as the Supreme Court doesn't rescind any rights that have already been passed by the New York State Capitol. Next. So the reason why we are also bringing this into is that a lot of New Yorkers, such as you all, believe that discrimination is still a serious problem. I know we all tend to think New York is this super liberal and super progressive place. It's really protective, but unfortunately, we just need an extra bit of leeway. There's too much leeway going on in New York State, and we just want to be ensured that this is being fully protected, and that, you know, with so much going on within New York State, especially with particular people that aren't really there for your rights to be in best interest, we want to make sure that this policy is in place. Like we said, like I always say, politicians come and go, policies are forever. So next. One of the things that we found that is particularly important for all of us, again, in regards to just adding on to the ERA, is that it helps us mobilize, because we just want to make sure that there's equity for all and equality for all. And that we're trying to aim to get everyone to fully comprehend and understand that you all and everyone who is under the ERA's classes have a right to be here, have a right to exist, have a right to live, and most importantly, have the right to feel safe and secure within your own state. Next. And and again, this is a really hard effort and task that we would like to ask you all for, because as you see here, there's not that many areas in which, although granted they have, the blue areas have a high voter turnout, there is not many areas that tend to be in our favor, but with the help with people like you all, we are able to get out the vote and to be able to spread the message across from New York State, which is why we really think the vote for November 2024 is very important. We need you all to come out to vote. We need you to tell your friends, family members, partners, the next door neighbor to go out next year and to vote and flip the ballot, not only to vote, but flip the ballot in particular and vote yes for the ERA. Next, please. And so what can you do right now? I can show you. What we're going to do is, well, this is one of the steps. I'm going to offer more thorough and very much more elaborate education in regards to the ERA and to really break it down as much as I possibly can. And if you invite me to any of your future chapter member meetings, not only with New Pride Agenda, but also in your own community, grassroots, anywhere, I'm happy to give fully comprehensive engagement, especially when it comes to things catered to your interests. Help us engage with other organizations. We're also going to be offering ways in which we can show you toolkits, training kits, and also more thorough education in regards to the ERA and what does ERA entail for your rights. And to also affirm your organization's support for New Yorkers Equal Rights. So we have social media tags that I will be happy to pass along to everyone here in the coming future to show that you are fully supportive, and as well as join our Grass Top Leadership meeting on November 17th, which is 2 days, where we're going to talk about post-election briefings of other areas that are really much equivalent to the ERA bill, such as Ohio. The next, please. And again, I want to re-emphasize the point. If you are curious and if you feel like you want to know a little bit more and what I haven't already told you, our website is right here, and as well as ways where you can find a way to get involved. Again, affirming your organization support. And of course, if you have any questions or if you want to find ways to get involved in regards to what I'm doing, especially when it comes to getting close to GOTV, feel free to email me. I'm happy to ask questions. I'm happy to meet anywhere to talk about this. And I'm also happy to just say hello and talk to you all. And I'm really, again, thank you for New Pride Agenda for allowing me to use your platform to sort of talk about this very important bill that affects everyone here.
Thank you, Nia, so much for joining us. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, and if does anyone have any questions, I'll be happy to answer right now as well.
If folks need a moment to ask a question, please feel free to also drop it in the chat.
I would like to jump in there really quickly before you introduce the next speaker, Britton. I just want to say that the New York State Equal Rights Amendment is a nationwide effort that is happening across many states. And this had to be passed over 2 separate legislative sessions before it could end up on the ballot next November. So this is the third and final step of what has been a really long effort by lots of advocates to get to this point. And if you've been paying attention to what's happening in the country, you know that the state of Ohio recently did this in their state and enshrined protections for their communities in their state's constitution. And so it's a huge deal, and I think the New York State version goes above and beyond most states' versions, and New York is really going to set the tone for the rest of the country. And we know that when abortion access is on the ballot, when LGBTQ rights are on the ballot, and our civil rights and civil liberties are on the ballot, that we generally win. And so, again, as Nia so graciously shared, make sure to turn over your ballot in the general election in 2024 to amend our state's constitution. And with that, I want to give it back to Britton Hargers.
Thank you so much, Elisa, for that. So I want to just go back really quick and cover some really quick house rules before we go into the next segment. So we're in the next segment. I'm just going to ask folks to remain muted throughout this presentation. Please utilize the chat if you have any questions or comments. Your cameras are optional, but we always love to see your faces. Be curious, but please stay respectful of our presenters as well as our presentee. So I would like to introduce the newest member of our team, one of my colleagues, Ferris, who is going to take us to the next section and introduce us to our guest speakers. Ferris.
Thanks, Britton. Hi, everyone. I'm Ferris. I use they, them pronouns, and I work for the New Pride Agenda as Policy Counsel. First, I want to thank you all for making the time this evening to attend our town hall. We've put so much thought and work into this, so thank you so much. In this next portion of our town hall, we'll be joined by advocates and policy experts to discuss 4 prospective pieces of legislation that will appear on our community ballot. As Alyssa mentioned a little bit earlier, we use our community ballot to hear from you all about what you want us to see, what you want to see us focus our advocacy efforts on. And as you'll see later on, our community ballot includes many more bills than these 4. We selected these bills basically to give you a sample of the kinds of bills that will appear on our community ballot. And just a reminder, anyone can feel free to use the chat box to submit questions for our speakers, because we'll be making time at the end to try to get to all of your questions. And so now I'd like to turn to our first speaker, Amir, to get us started. Amir, could you introduce yourself and tell us about your work?
Yes, thank you, Ferris. Thank you, New Pride Agenda team for creating some space to talk about this really important bill. We're so excited to partner with you and be featured here. I mean, it's amazing, all the comrades here on this meeting. But my name is Amir Sadeghi. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the policy and advocacy manager at CHLP. CHLP is an abolitionist legal and policy organization that envisions and works for a world where HIV and other stigmatized health conditions are no longer criminalized, but met with compassion and the resources to thrive. So I spend every day building power with marginalized networks and communities of people living with HIV across the country to fight against HIV criminalization and other criminal laws and dehumanizing policies that confront people living with HIV and people living with other stigmatized diseases.
Thanks, Amir. I know that you mentioned the criminalization of having an STI. Can you describe to us what that means and what are the different ways that people living with an STI are criminalized?
Yes, that's a very good question, Ferris. I think that one of the easiest ways to understand what HIV criminalization is, if you're new to this really dehumanizing, horrible policy, is it's the arrest, prosecution, or imprisonment of people living with HIV for things that are either not a crime for people not living with HIV, or are minor offenses that aren't typically enforced. So it's using the criminal law, really any criminal law, even a general crime like reckless endangerment, aggravated assault, attempted murder even, using any criminal law in a way where someone's health status as a person living with HIV is a necessary component of that offense. So 30 states across the country have an HIV-specific criminal law that singles out people living with HIV for really disproportionate punishment simply because they're living with HIV and they engage in some kind of conduct or they don't disclose their status allegedly prior to some kind of exposure or activity. So New York actually doesn't have an HIV-specific criminal law, but here in New York, Public Health Law 2307 is a very problematic law that criminalizes the sexual activity of anybody living with an STI. So it's broader than just HIV. It could be any STI. And the real issue here too is that in other states, people living with HIV face criminalization because they allegedly don't disclose their status prior to, let's say, consensual sex, which consensual sex is obviously not a crime if you're not living with HIV. But if you're living with HIV in a lot of other states, it's a felony, really horrible felony level enforcement. But what triggers prosecution in New York is not even the alleged not disclosing, not sharing your status prior to some kind of sexual activity. Our law in New York State just criminalizes sex while living with an STI. The law is very stigmatizing. It uses, believe it or not, the language of venereal disease. That's how old and stigmatizing this law is. The original version of this offense was written in like 1909. It was amended to its current form in about like 1946 or 47, I believe. It's still on the books. It uses stigmatizing, out-of-date language, and 0 prosecutions under this law in New York State require proof that the transmission of a communicable disease or an STI actually happened. 0 prosecutions. 0 prosecutions under this offense require proof that somebody intended to transmit HIV or an STI to somebody else. 0 prosecutions under this offense require proof that what you're criminalized for could have even scientifically or theoretically resulted in the transmission of an STI. So this law punishes and criminalizes sexual activities, for example, oral sex if you're living with HIV, that pose virtually 0 risk of transmitting HIV. Let's say you're virally suppressed and you're adhering to your treatment plan as a person living with HIV, meaning it's impossible to sexually transmit HIV to somebody else. You could still be criminalized. So there's really 0 evidence out there that laws like this reduce HIV diagnoses or other STI diagnoses. And offenses like this are really disproportionately used. They are a weapon and an instrument to enforce white supremacy and anti-Blackness and queer phobia and transphobia in the criminal law. These offenses are disproportionately used against marginalized Black and brown, queer, and trans New Yorkers and people across the country, especially sex workers. People at the intersection of sex work and HIV face a lot of criminal punishment through this. So, and I think, Ferris, the other part of your question is like, how might a case come about? Like, how might an arrest come about? In a couple ways. I mentioned sex work. Really, it could happen with an anti-sex worker sting operation where law enforcement are targeting sex workers. They learn that somebody is living with HIV or another STI, and they could face prosecution under this offense and also face, criminalization for sex work as well. So, or another dynamic that we've heard about on the ground is where somebody maybe in a relationship who knows, somebody has already disclosed their status in a romantic relationship, but maybe the relationship goes, not in the great direction. Somebody breaks up, and then somebody, that person might say, well, you didn't disclose your status to me. And that could also trigger an investigation and really result in the criminalization of someone living with HIV or another STI.
So I wanted to call attention to this fact sheet that I just dropped in the chat. That was developed by the Center for HIV Law and Policy, and it includes a lot more information about this act that Amir is speaking to. So Amir, you spoke a little bit about the stigmatizing effect of criminalization. Could you also speak a little bit more to the range of consequences that follow an arrest and a conviction? And you mentioned sex workers and certain communities. Who are the communities who are most affected by this?
Yes, thank you, Ferris. This is really important questions to lift up right now. And, as far as like the communities who are most impacted, 73% of people living with HIV currently in New York are either Black or Hispanic or Latinx. And Black and brown New Yorkers account for over 75% of new HIV diagnoses. So this is what white supremacy looks like. This is what white supremacy looks like in the criminal legal system, or sorry, in our health system and in our society. And it's communities like Black and brown communities and queer and trans and other LGBTQ communities who face disproportionate enforcement for these laws. So, you know, really, it's the communities who our health infrastructure or health system is failing to reach, the same people who are overrepresented in HIV diagnoses, overrepresented in other STI diagnoses, who are also the same communities targeted and over-policed and criminalized because of their health status. And as far as like the other rippling consequences and chain reaction that criminalization could infect, you know, a conviction for this STI criminalization law in New York could be considered a crime of moral turpitude, which means it could be a deportable offense. This, you know, a criminalization in New York, criminalizing somebody because of their HIV status or their health status, living with another STI, could have immediate immigration or asylum consequences for New Yorkers here. And I think a lot of us on the call are very plugged in and aware that the political climate right now around migrants, even amongst people we've traditionally relied on or been forced to rely on because the other side is so, you know, dehumanizes us in our communities every day. Even the folks we traditionally have relied on are, I think, trafficking in some really horrific, dehumanizing rhetoric around migrants. So that's one consequence. I mean, criminalization has a load of consequences for somebody. It will affect their access to housing, access to other kinds of social services. And really, you know, even though the New York law is a misdemeanor, punishable by up to 1 year in prison, I think for a lot of us who have either direct lived experience of criminalization or belong to communities who are hyper-policed, any contact with the criminal legal system is barbaric and rips us of our humanity and is violent and opens the door for more violence. So yes, the bill, it's Assembly Bill 3347, introduced by Assembly Member Jessica Gonzalez Rojas, and it's also carried by Senator Hoylman Siegel in the Senate, Senate Bill 4603. It would repeal this law. It would expunge records for people who've been criminalized for this law. And there was a recent prosecution under this law just as recently as last year. So this is still being used. It's still being used to criminalize and target LGBTQ New Yorkers, Black and brown New Yorkers. The bill would also create a defense to where it would create a defense where your health status as a person living with an STI could not be used to create criminal liability for engaging in consensual sex for prosecution of other crimes, which is very important because New York has used general crimes like reckless endangerment and aggravated assault to criminalize people living with HIV, even for things like spitting or biting, which cannot transmit HIV. So people living with HIV could still face criminalization here through general crimes, and this important bill would take some steps to address that too.
And I think the last question I have for you, Amir, is, and we've included a pretty short summary of the bill on the screen. We've run through quite a lot of it, but could you just walk us through, for those of us who are less familiar with the public health laws or the criminal laws, what the impact of these changes would be, also focusing on what the impact of an expungement would be?
Yes, thank you, Ferris. So, you know, the impact would be, you know, really substantial. You know, I know this town hall is really geared towards centering equity. And you know, it's so important in my work to center people living with HIV and communities affected by HIV. And we cannot have equity by criminalizing people because of their health status, because of a protected disability like HIV. We cannot have equity by criminalizing and punishing people, queer and trans people, for having any kind of STI or living with any kind of STI, I should say. So some of the immediate consequences, this law goes away. It gets repealed. This really stigmatizing, out of date law that doesn't keep us safe, it's used to and weaponized against us in our communities would be repealed. And your records, if you have been criminalized under this offense, would be sealed. They would be expunged, which is another really important component of this bill. So it would mean that a conviction under this law won't be a barrier for you to access services, housing, a job, anything, kind of like that. And that last part of the bill, like I was saying, there have been prosecutions of general crimes, things that don't reference HIV, that are used to punish other kinds of activities in the criminal code, right? Like reckless endangerment, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, things like that. People living with HIV have been prosecuted for crimes like that in New York in the past. And some of these prosecutions aren't from that long ago. They're from the 2010s, right? That's just a few years ago. So the good news on some of those cases is the Court of Appeals has reversed some of those decisions, and there is good precedent here in New York along some of those prosecutions. But the really great thing that this bill does would be to make sure that criminal liability, that your health status as a person living with HIV can't be used to determine criminal liability for a prosecution like that. So it's really important. And I know I'm at time, and I just want to thank New Pride Agenda again. You all are my heroes. You're doing such amazing work, and I really thank you all for having me here today. I can drop some information about the bill in the chat for folks participating here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amir, for breaking that down. We're so pleased to have you as well. Thank you so much. And for anyone who has any questions for Amir, Amir's going to be sticking around for a little bit after our last speaker to handle some Q&A. So if you have questions, you could feel free to drop them in the chat box. And so now we'll be moving on to our second speaker for tonight. Quadira, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you do?
Yeah. Good evening, everyone. And thank you to the New Pride Agenda for having me here to speak on comprehensive sex education. My name is Quadira Coles. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Director of Policy at Girls for Gender Equity, where we work intergenerationally to center the leadership of Black girls and gender expansive youth of color and reshaping culture and policy through advocacy. We have youth-centered programming, and we do a lot of culture shifting and narrative building work to achieve gender and racial justice. And one of the core pieces of my work is working in coalition with other organizations to pass the comprehensive sex education bill in the state legislature, but also shifting the narrative of what this bill actually means and how it would actually impact students.
So it's been a while since probably all of us have been in grade school. Could you remind us what New York schools are currently required to teach with respect to sex ed?
Yeah. So currently, New York State does not require public schools to have a comprehensive K-12 sex education curriculum or instruction that meets the national standard of being medically accurate and encompassing like basic sexual and relationship health, consent, sexuality, and gender identity, and conversations about bodily autonomy. We currently have simple health instruction that's required for grades 6 through 12, with a heavy emphasis on HIV prevention and some instruction on mental health. So the comprehensive sex education bill seeks to create a standard that can be implemented throughout the state, covering topics that are not just limited to HIV prevention, but expands to make way for topics like healthy relationships, body image, and self-esteem. And this is critically important for the development of growing youth, especially LGBTQ plus community.
Thank you so much. And you began to speak to a little bit of what comprehensive means. Could you speak a little bit more about that? What are the different topics that kids would be expected to learn about, and at what grade levels? If you could summarize a little bit of that.
Yeah, so one of the biggest misconceptions of this bill is that it will inappropriately teach children about sex. End of sentence. But when you look at the model curriculums for comprehensive sex ed, you'll see that they are and should be age appropriate by national standard. So like students in kindergarten, for example, will begin to learn basic lessons about friendships, communication, which will provide them with building blocks they will need to tackle issues like consent and sexual health that they will be learning in middle school and high school. At older ages, lessons include things like health, preventing unintended pregnancies and STIs, intimate partner violence, and again, most importantly, about consent. At all ages, comprehensive sex education will seek to dispel stigmas around sexuality and gender and combat discrimination, bullying, and harassment while promoting respect, dignity, and autonomy for all youth.
Thank you so much. And because this town hall has a lot to do with the rights of the LGBTQ people, could you tell us more about what this bill would mean for LGBTQ students?
So overwhelmingly, students ask for a better sexuality health education, specifically for it to be inclusive of all genders and sexualities and with a focus on consent and relationships. Students have also reported that sex ed is given a little too late and should be implemented at a younger age, and they don't want to rely on their parents for sex education for a number of reasons. So the bottom line is sex ed addresses health disparities, reduces instances of violence, and promotes wellness. Now I'm going to lay out some data points, and they may be a little outdated since the pandemic, but when this bill was written, these data points were important to justify the needs of it. So about 3 to 10 women or people who can get pregnant in New York became pregnant at least once before their 20th birthday. And teenagers represented about 50% of new STI cases in New York. Now, I know that the rate of teen pregnancy has drastically decreased since 2020, but the rate of STIs have increased at the same time. Nationally, more than 2/3 of teenagers who have been in a relationship report experiencing some form of sexual, physical, or emotional abuse. In New York City, about 12% of teenagers reported experiencing physical dating violence. And we know that during the pandemic, instances of intimate partner violence were steadily increasing, and we really hope to capture some accurate data on that in the next couple of years. Gay, lesbian, bisexual students are almost twice as likely as heterosexual students to report not going to school because they felt unsafe at or on their way to or from school. For transgender folks or in gender or nonconforming youth, school can be a little more difficult. In New York, 74% of transgender students or those who have been perceived as transgender experience some form of mistreatment, whether it be verbal harassment, physical assault, and sexual violence between grades kindergarten to 12th grade. So school victimization have been linked to a decreased academic achievement, increased suicide ideation, increased rates of school absence, and negative impact on their emotional health. So all young people deserve the kind of education that the comprehensive sex education bill seeks to mandate. They deserve that kind of knowledge and skills and resources to make healthy and informed decisions about their bodies and relationships, and just to also build tolerance for the difference that is represented in our schools, especially today.
So you and everyone at Girls for Gender Equity are doing so much work to get this bill passed. What has been the reaction from students, parents, and educators when you speak with them about this bill?
Yeah. So comprehensive sex ed will empower and educate students to protect their health and build their futures without shame or judgment, which is really important, and allow parents to feel more comfortable knowing that their children are receiving education that is holistic and truly supports their well-being, because a lot of parents don't feel equipped to have these conversations because things have changed since they were growing up and they themselves have not received comprehensive sex education. And I think it will also give teachers the space and opportunities to teach and help students succeed. It is critical that New York students receive this education, especially after the pandemic, where just basic human interaction and dynamics look completely different than it did before 2020. and an increased amount of time we spent internalizing narratives from the internet, which can lead to a lot of misinformation and shame about who we are and how to properly care for ourselves and each other. So over the next couple of years, we should be working on making data and research current to gauge where we are with gender-based violence and health outcomes. We should be working to shift dominant narratives and debunking myths around the nature of comprehensive sex education. And most importantly, we should be working together to pass the bill, period.
Thank you so much for explaining that. Like, we know that this bill is just as important for students as it is for parents and educators, especially right now when there's so many national conversations about what teachers and parents are even allowed to talk to students about. So thank you for calling attention to that.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And that was our final question for Kadira. If anyone has any questions, she'll be sticking around a little bit for a Q&A. And so now we'll be moving on to our third of 4 speakers for tonight. Mick, would you be able to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your work?
Yes, thank you so much for having me here. My name is Mick. I'm a white transgender man. I use he, him pronouns. I'm currently an attorney at Legal Aid Society, New York City. I have my whole sort of professional career has been working with trans and non-binary intersex people who are in the city jails or the state prisons of New York. And that includes being on a task force on issues affecting folks in the New York City jails, and going into Rikers on a semi-weekly basis to teach classes.
Thank you. So you've been providing services to incarcerated TGNC people for a while. Could you speak a little bit about the conditions that your clients have been living through on the inside?
Yeah, and in talking about this, it's important to emphasize that prisons and jails are horrific places for every single person who's inside them. And when I say that, I also include the volunteers who go in, the healthcare workers who go in, that the amount of trauma that a person individually experiences and then the secondary trauma that people witness and sometimes are unable to intervene. My God, I cannot say that word, but interfere creates enormous ongoing problems. So just as a baseline, prisons and jails do not assist us in any way that we are told they assist us. They are absolutely an extension of chattel slavery. They are a way to disappear people who are not considered to be of use or who are unwanted. Some of the most intensive forms of eugenics in the United States currently are happening because of prisons and jails. So that is just sort of a baseline for every single person. Non-binary and trans and intersex people are particularly at risk because of our gender identities and expressions. We're not trusted all the way from the point of arrest to incarceration. And so we end up with longer sentences. We end up with poor representation. We end up with combined disciplinary tickets when we're inside because of the ways that we express ourselves. And sometimes even just like the amazing sort of fierce refusal to be mistreated. I, for example, have had a client get disciplinary tickets, which is, by the way, means placement in solitary confinement and removal of certain things that are considered to be benefits, such as phone calls or packages. So not really benefits, just basic things. But I have a client who has been given solitary confinement for having too many hair ties because she was in a men's jail. Men are not allowed to have any hair ties. She had 2 hair ties. The fact that she does not identify as a man should not have been in the men's jail. And the number of hair ties anyone has, regardless of gender identity, should not result in anyone going to solitary confinement, didn't play into what happened to her. That's just sort of a brief overview that it's horrible for everyone. Trans and non-binary intersex people get particularly signaled out. We serve longer sentences. We probably didn't have great counsel to begin with. We get very isolated. And so there's a lack of opportunity also for things like law library or programming that can either assist you in getting out earlier or just like help to make the time less horrific. So it's a horrible, horrible place.
Thank you for that, Mick. What are the rules or laws that are currently governing how incarcerated TGMC people are housed and treated on the inside? And how effective are those?
So one of the main problems is that the rules and laws that govern this are varied, not only in what type of authority they carry, but also in how strictly they are implemented and whether or not you have grounds for legal recourse if they are violated. It has been the law of the majority of the United States that you cannot house transgender people or non-binary or intersex people based upon their genitalia since 2012. That said, that is de facto how almost every single person is housed. So that's a federal law. There are a few states who didn't opt into that federal law, but New York definitely did. It's called the Prison Rape Elimination Act. The Prison Rape Elimination Act doesn't have a right to a lawsuit in it. And so what that means is that you must use it in conjunction with another law that has a right to a lawsuit within it. So 8th Amendment, 14th Amendment are the common ones. But just because they have used your current genital status to determine where you're housed doesn't give you the right to a lawsuit on its own, which is really hard to explain to anyone because it's really hard to explain why something that is the law doesn't have a way to enforce it. And it's also really hard to explain why a prison or a jail can just completely ignore a law that they say that they're in line with and no consequences happen. In all honesty, it was not until I went to law school that I even knew such a thing could happen because I assumed that laws were laws. They certainly are laws when like Black and brown people and poor people and queer and trans people violate them. They just aren't laws when the state violates them. There's also some administrative directives that again are not enforceable under law because they're considered guidance. There are some court settlements that are very, very specific to certain counties like Broome County, Steuben County. There are also there's one other form that I've now forgotten about. An executive order. New York City also has an executive order. Again, that's not being followed either, and there's no enforcement mechanism for the executive law either. So we have these laws, they're very disparate, there's no way to enforce them. And the reality on the ground that we hear every single day from people on the inside is that trans folks are being housed based upon how random people within the Department of Corrections believe they should be housed, which almost always means trans women as men and trans men as women. And then intersex and non-binary people by the status of their genitalia. That is, again, just to highlight, that is illegal. So if you have a friend or if you know someone for whom that's happened, like definitely connect me to them. But it's an illegal practice and it's going on and it's happening almost for every single person.
Thank you so much, Mick. Clearly, there's a range of huge issues that people are facing on the inside. And so I've included a summary on the screen of the Gender Identity, Respect, Dignity, and Safety Act. Mick, can you walk us through what the changes in the law would be as a result of passage of this bill? And how would it address the different issues that we've been touching on? And what would it mean for people on the inside?
So the primary thing that it would do is what is highlighted in the first bullet point, which is that prisons and jails across New York State, so it would create a uniform system for New York State, would have to default to presumptively housing a trans, non-binary, intersex person according to our gender identity, unless we request otherwise. That is put in because, you know, I've worked with a lot of folks who, for various different reasons, feel safer in one system versus in the other, or for non-binary folks, there isn't a non-binary jail or prison. So like you have to make a decision, unfortunately, within a binary system. And so that would be the main difference that it would create, is that instead of what they currently do, which is a case-by-case assessment only if and when either you as a very, very vocal incarcerated person or your team of advocates on the outside force them to do a case-by-case assessment of you, or being housed according to your current genitalia. And what that would mean is hard to put into words because it is a little bit, unfortunately, it is a little bit contradictory. Because on one hand, what it means is that our trans and non-binary intersex siblings who are inside will be, the prisons and jails will be forced to see us as who we are by housing us according to our gender identity or our sex. However, that is still going to be in a prison or a jail system, and it doesn't mean much of anything, honestly, in terms of your overall wellness within a prison system, because you're still within that system. And so it's very, very important to see that this bill is part of the larger abolition movement and a larger decarceration movement. And it is to minimize and sort of triage the pain that people are in currently today and have been in. There are some folks who I work with who have been inside since, there was one person who's been inside since 1985, a trans woman. She came home actually 2 years ago, but she had been inside since 1985. So folks who have been in this sort of horrific pain for decades, it alleviates some of that pain by at least seeing them, forcing the prison system to house us according to who we are, and then makes it easier for us to then access something. So for example, a transgender woman who was housed in a women's prison is going to have better access to women's programming, women's housing, the things that are specific to her with her gender identity that are not going to be available in the men's prison. It is against the law in New York State for an alternative to incarceration program, a halfway house, et cetera, to discriminate against transgender people on the basis of their gender identity. It is legal for the state, the prisons, to do so. So that means that these same, let's say, drug treatment program that would go into the women's prison and say, hey, we have housing available, sign up for a housing, doesn't go to the men's program and therefore doesn't get the majority of trans women. If trans women are in the women's prisons, they'll then have more access to that programming. So it's in some ways, it means a world of difference, an enormous change. The letters I get from my clients who we've successfully gone to transfer over to trans women who have been in women's prisons, you know, they talk about just like an enormous amount of weight lifting from their shoulders, like not having to fear every time they go to a shower, not having to fear every time that someone else who is incarcerated approaches them, that there will be either a request for sex or some kind of harassment will happen. So the relief is enormous. The relief of that kind of pain is enormous. At the same time, important to remember that is one step as we go towards abolition.
Thank you so much, Mick. It was really helpful to hear all of that. I think that's all of our questions for today. And if anyone has any questions for Mick, you could drop them in the chat. Thank you so much, Mick.
Thanks. If I could just briefly say, I'm happy to stay around afterwards, and I'm going to put some documents in the chat. We have a coalition because we very much want this to be a ground up led movement. So if folks want to join the coalition, I'm going to put that link in the chat.
Thank you so much. And as Mick was saying, we're going to be having some resources from our speakers that we'll send out in an email afterwards. Or if our speakers want to drop them in the chat now, feel free to do so. But I will be following up a little bit later with more reading materials. And so now we'll move to our final speaker for tonight. Ace, could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Ace Sutherland. My pronouns are they, them. I'm the Director of Community Organizing at Equality New York. We are the largest statewide advocacy organization rooted in queer and trans liberation. I'm also the board chair of Trans Lifeline. And I think most importantly, I come to this space being a immigrant. I was born and raised in the country of Jamaica. I am trans identifying. I am a multitude of different things. I'm disabled. I'm all these things. And all my identities will inform the way that I answer the questions that you asked today. So again, just thank you for having me, Ferris. Thank you for having me, MPA. Thank you to my team, Amanda, Melissa, Scholars, everybody for being here. I'm really honored to be in this space with you.
Thank you, Ace. We're really glad to having you tonight too. So as I asked Qadira, it's been a little while since probably all of us have been in grade school. Could you let us know what New York schools are currently required to teach with respect to the history of LGBTQ people?
Yeah. So actually, they're not required to teach anything. I want to note, though, that both New York City and New York State affiliates or activists have given different ways to encourage and empower teachers to teach LGBT plus curriculum. Specifically, I'm going to drop this in the chat. I was just reading about the Hidden Voices Project, which is a collaboration with the Museum of the City of New York and the New York City Department of Education that started in 2018 to help New York City students learn about what happens with those that are typically hidden in the curriculum, including LGBT plus people. So that's one thing. I'm going to drop that right here. The next thing that I did see as well is that New York City Department of Education actually has like a LGBTQ support section on their website too. Again, encouraging our educators to provide this kind of curriculum. However, they're not mandated to provide this curriculum. So if you're a teacher, your educator is not someone that is an ally or a part of the community, and they are one of the bigots, let's name them that, they might not teach it at all, or they might teach what the opposition wants them to learn about us, which is that we are sexual predators. We are not to be around children. We are groomers and things like that. Harmful language that we hear every single day.
Ace, could you speak a little bit to what the impact on young LGBTQ people, what the impact of this legislation would be on them, for them to be able to learn about their community's history as from a very young age?
Absolutely. First off, I want to say that currently only 4 states require teaching LGBT history, and they are New Jersey, Colorado, Illinois, and California. The fact that New York State is not one of those states says a lot, because we are typically at the forefront of progressive issues and policies. So I just want to name that. Additionally, if we are learning about the civil rights movement, Black Lives Matter, women's suffrage, or like Roe versus Wade, all these other civil rights issues, then why are we not learning about the Stonewall riots and trans liberation? For students to not know their history they're going to be deemed to repeat it again, right? That's actually in the bill language. One of the justification reasons for the state bill is that if we do not know our history, we will repeat it again. Y'all hear that? Because right now we are actually repeating it again. We are criminalizing. We are making marginalized individuals, specifically LGBTQIA plus, however you want to name it, the alphabet mafia. We are making our community members feel unsafe, and we're taking away their lives on a daily basis. So we are repeating history. So in sum, I believe that if we were to allow our students to learn about our community, it would normalize us. It would make them understand us and humanize us on a daily basis, right? They won't go out and see 2 women kissing or 2 men kissing and think that's disgusting. They'll say, oh, I saw that in a book and it was okay. It's a part of our history. It's a part of our curriculum, right? Think about this. We learn about Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks. Why not Marsha P. Johnson? Why not Sylvia Rivera, right? Why not these individuals that are also big, like, inspirations in our daily activism and had to deal with a lot of, I'm gonna name it, BS that happened before, right? So I believe that it is very important to teach our kids our history so that we could be normalized and humanized just like every other marginalized identity.
Yeah, it's such a shame to know that New York has fallen behind in this way, considering so much of our movement's history happened here. So that's surprising and pretty disappointing. So I want to call attention to the fact that a pretty fierce national conversation is going on about whether LGBTQ people can even be mentioned in schools and books. What message would passage of this bill send to our communities in New York?
Yeah, so I also want to name that although I'm an activist now and a lot of what I'm known for is around that, I come from state government. A lot of my experience is with the legislation. What are words? It is Tuesday, Wednesday. I don't know what day it is. Anyway, I worked at the Division of the Budget, specifically doing a lot of Department of Health legislation, both in the budget and in appropriation bills. So I've written state law. I've done all of this, right? And I think that I've seen time and time again, New York State be at the forefront of these progressive issues. And so many times we're at the negotiating table and they're like, well, if California is doing it, we should do it next because we are New York. We are the best state ever, right? So why have we not centered LGBT plus individuals, right? Yes, we passed a safe haven bill. That's amazing. That's great. Shout out to MPA, Equality New York, and all our other coalition partners that got that bill signed. However, there is still so much work left. And being New York, with the fact that we passed the safe haven bill, being the fact that we are pro marijuana recreational use, that we're pro immigrants in a way, we're pro every other marginalized issue, we need to make sure that we are pro this issue. Passing it allows others, including those that are directly impacted, to understand that LGBTQ people are necessary, they're important, and they matter, to put it simply.
Thank you so much, Ace. And so I think the final question for tonight is, how would future generations, how would it change culture if future generations of students, both LGBT and not, how would culture change if they were all required to learn about LGBTQ history?
You know, I laugh at that because I didn't know anything about my own LGBTQ history up until I met Amanda in Equality New York. I did not know about Marsha P. Johnson. I did not know about Sylvia Rivera. I didn't know like Equality New York, New Pride Agenda. I didn't know that these organizations existed, to be honest with you, because I wasn't taught that this was something that was okay, right? Being born and raised in a country that is so homophobic and transphobic, and then migrating to America where I'm still in that culture because I'm in my mom's household, right? I was very sheltered from what could have been, or what I could have learned, or what I should have been Googling. I was Googling things I shouldn't have been Googling when I should have been Googling LGBT plus history. So now I'm stuck. I'm learning. I'm playing catch up with my counterparts because that wasn't taught to me in school. I'm learning about every other issue, every other genocide, every other thing that people deal with on a daily basis. And while that is important, so is what queer and trans people go through, especially queer and trans New Yorkers. So if they were to, and when we get this bill passed, let me change my language because I believe in tension and manifesting. When we pass this bill in the upcoming legislative session with our champions, Senator Brad Hoylman Siegel and Assemblywoman Rebecca Seawright, we are going to make sure that individuals don't repeat history. Individuals humanize queer and trans people. They understand that we should not be fighting for basic human rights. They understand that we are equally as important as Black people are. We are equally as important as disabled people are. We're all at the end of the day fighting for the same thing, but at the foundation, we're just changing the language. We're changing the marginalized group that we are centering, but we're all fighting for the same thing, and it's disgusting. So we have to do what needs to be done to get this passed so that we know that our queer and trans New Yorkers and worldwide are part of our history in books, because we're already a part of history in execution.
Thank you so much, Ace. I'm also very much in the same boat of learning a lot about this history, like later on in life, even though I grew up in New York.
Right.
A little bit confusing, but yeah, that's where we're at right now. So that actually concludes our discussion with our speakers, at least our one-on-one questions with them. It doesn't look like we have questions in the Q&A for our speakers, but I thought it would be great to close out our discussion with just one more question for everyone, which is, what is the key point or key information that you would like the attendees tonight to take away from tonight? And our speakers could, if you have something to say about that, you could take some turns to turn on your mic.
I could go first if that's okay. I would love for everyone in this room. I know that it's a myriad of different types of folks and kind of types of organizations that we represent, but I want y'all to know that groups like New Pride Agenda and Equality New York and even the Center, like, we are so deep into this advocacy stuff that we can talk about the 100, the 101s of it all, right? Like, if you want to learn how to write a bill and how to look up a bill, please ask us to provide that resource for you. We're here. We get paid to do this work and provide this education. We just need to be asked, right? And while I don't believe in using the word stupid because it is ableist, I want to say there are no stupid and or silly questions, yo. Just hit us up, ask us, and we were here to provide and educate you, because the way that I'm playing catch up, I want to make sure that someone else doesn't have to as well.
And I do want to jump in and echo what Ace said earlier, essentially about our work being very intersectional. Like, we're all fighting for the same things. We're just changing the language of it. So something that I have been emphasizing in my advocacy across the board, outside of comprehensive sex education, like all the work that I do, whether it be with GGE or just outside of GGE, is that our movements have to be intersectional at its core. We need to be fighting for the same thing at the same time and not pitting one issue against another, because at the end of the day, we are a part of marginalized communities and we're fighting against one big machine, which is white supremacy, patriarchy, and all the other isms and archies that are out there. So that's just what I had to add.
I think I want to jump in and just build on that and say, in particular, I think it's really important for if you have an organization that is an LGBTQ focused organization or a trans focused organization, that you make sure that you have a focus on criminalization and the way that surveillance impacts our communities. A lot of the times folks think that LGBTQ issues stop being relevant upon arrest. And actually that's when in some ways they are super relevant. And in the same vein, a lot of criminal justice organizations do not have enough of an understanding of queer and trans identities. One of the things I try to do is bridge that gap. But whatever you can do in your own place of work or your own place of advocacy to address that. Obviously, I think DIRDS is an amazing bill. I think it should pass. I think it would make an enormous difference. But like, even things like checking to see if your organization has an ID policy for the front door, like things like that actually make a huge difference to like make it a more equitable space.
Thank you, Mick.
Yeah, I'd love to build off of that too. What Mick and Kadir have mentioned. I think an intersectional analysis is so important. Just to paraphrase Audre Lorde, who there are no one issue fights because we don't lead one issue lives. And I think it's a really important analysis here. And something really I'd hope people can walk away from this is to please contact your state senator and assembly member and ask them to co-sponsor this STI decrim bill, because New York is pretty behind. Like other states, Illinois just repealed their HIV specific law. New Jersey, in a way, repealed it. So New York's kind of behind on this, and it would be great to get us in a better place.
Thank you, Amir. So that concludes our discussion about legislation for tonight. Thank you so much to our speakers. That was super informative. And for all the attendees, I hope that this really helps you make your decisions in the community ballot, which my colleague Key will be speaking a little bit about right now. So I'll turn it over to Key.
Can we just pause, like, and either virtually or if you're on video, or get off mic if you can, and just clap it up for that panel, like clap it up for the fact that folks took their time out to do the research. And honestly, I've been doing this work for some time, for about 15 years, transparently. So and so as somebody who is a founding member of Black Lives Matter, as somebody who transitioned that work from BLM to climate justice work to now, and I really resonate with you, Ace, finding my lane with my own community, my own people, who has all of the identities that I embody, right, as a transmasculine person. And so jumping into advocacy and education work like we do here at New Pride Agenda, for me, is like encompassing and bringing all of that experience, all of that history, all of that legacy at my back, right? And being like, yo, I'm here to give what I could give, where you need me, how can I support? And I just want to shout out to the New Pride Agenda team And shout out to just like everybody in this space. There are 30 of us here now. There's about like 10 more who dropped off through the night. The fact that folks are taking their time the week before Thanksgiving, right? We're at the end of the year, folks are burnt out, right? But the fact that we're all here, like, let's organize, let's listen to one another, let's learn from one another, right? And let's actually show up and support one another. When we were looking at the RSVPs, we're like, yo, this organization, that organization, this group, right? Like, the fact that we're all in a shared space, I don't think that happens enough. I think that, you know, we have multiple organizations, but there's so few of us, right? And like the fact that I think we should always be in these spaces together as often as possible. And so I'm just honored to be in this space and to share community with y'all, and keep the spirits going. And Amir, thank you so much for that Audre Lorde quote, because I think that it's actually really important and really key, right? And just like continue to honor that legacy and that work. Shout out to Rochester in the building, shout out to Buffalo in the building, shout out to Albany in the building, right? Like shout out to New York State, and shout out for all of us wanting to get New York State back on top, right? Really honestly getting us back on top. So I'm gonna transition really quickly, and share my screen really, really briefly, and into this last part, your action item. Wouldn't be an organizer if we didn't have a call to action, right? And so the call to action here we're going to end on tonight. My name is Key. I use they and them pronouns. I'm a native New Yorker, upstate, downstate connect. And I am the program manager here. But as I said, I bring everybody here with me whenever I enter any space. And so one thing that we wanted to bring back that we launched last year as a statewide organization is really setting the tone for what are we going to be asking our state leaders for in the upcoming year. We know how it goes. They work January to April, maybe through June if we're lucky, right? So like let's end the year off, and like as we go into the holidays and we think about what we're going to do, what we're going to be asking for, what does that look like? And as a community, what does that look like? Right. And so here's the opportunity. We'll be sending this out. We'll be posting it on our social media tonight or tomorrow, depending on how tired Lisa is. But you'll be seeing it on the email blast. You'll be seeing it on our social media, and you'll be seeing it in a toolkit, kind of a call to action for you to share with your network and your community. So that way we can determine what does our community agenda look like. So the opportunity here is, if you look at here, you have the bit.ly / Community Ballot 2024, real easy. It'll be linked in our bio. And the ballot process is this really simple Google form. It contains 15 different bills this year. And I want to emphasize that it contains 15 different bills that does contain the 4 ones that we hit on today: GERS, STID, CRIM, comprehensive sex ed, and LGBTQ inclusive curriculum. But it also hits on other bills that we might not think should be there, like good cause for eviction, right? Like what does that have to do with the LGBTQ community? So I encourage folks, when you get the ballot link and you look at it, to read through the descriptions, and think about how that's going to impact our community in general. Now, the other part of this is that you can only vote for 3. There's 15 on the ballot box. You can only vote for 3. And those 3 will be the 3 that we set as our community agenda for next year. Right? So it's going to be hard. Like it's not an easy job to be like, what are the 3 we're going to really, really focus on that the community wants us to do? Not saying we're not going to do the other 15, not saying we're not going to center those other 4 that we shared tonight, but from where you stand, your lived experiences, where you are as a community member, what would you like the 2024 LGBTQ advocacy agenda to look like? What are the 3 that really speak to you, speak to your heart, your experience? And then we're going to call on GGE, we're going to call on Equality New York, we're going to call on NYTAG, right? We're going to call on all the folks that collaborate with us to carry it through, because we can't do this work alone. We don't do this work alone. We don't want to do this work alone. It's lonely, right? It's lonely going to Albany sometimes. We've talked about it. It's lonely. We don't need to do that. We need to take care of ourselves, take care of each other. So I just want to briefly share that you'll be seeing the community ballot be launched, and our ask is for you to vote, and then get somebody else to vote, and get somebody else to vote. So that way we can say, you know what, we got 500 queer New Yorkers, 1,000 queer New Yorkers who decided this is what we want to happen in our legislation. And then we're gonna go to Albany and fight for it. So I'm gonna get off my soapbox. I'm gonna stop talking for tonight. I'm gonna transition it over to Alyssa, But I just want y'all to know that, again, we can only do this work if we're doing this work together. And I'm really, really, really excited to be doing this work. And I'm always excited for us to be in community spaces together. So thank you all so much. And I'm going to turn it over to Alyssa to close us.
Thank you so much, Key. And I just want to clarify that, yes, each individual should only vote for their top 3 bills on the ballot. And the reason why we only want to prioritize 3 is because if you know anything about the Pride agenda, we like to win and be successful, and we like to be strategic about our resources, our capacity, our time. We know it is unlikely that all 15 will pass in one legislative session. So we want this agenda for 2024 to be the community's agenda. We want to base build. We want to make sure that there's buy-in. And yes, we want to prioritize our energy on 3 top bills and pass those 3 bills. So with that, it is 1 minute to 8. I want us to be timely and punctual. I want to thank all of our speakers and partner organizations, Ace Sutherland from Equality New York. I want to thank, of course, Amir from the Center for HIV Law and Policy. I want to thank Mick from Legal Aid. And I want to thank Quadira from Girls for Gender Equity, and of course, Nia from New Yorkers for Equal Rights. Don't forget to turn over the ballot next November. Kiara, that's an interesting point. We may slip in a write-in. I like that. And so I also want to thank my team. Thank you so much, Ferris, for your work in Hargers, Key Williams. And I said, we will see you in Albany. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful evening.